The observation deck of the Stellar Harmony hummed with the usual cacophony of galactic commerce. Merchants from a dozen species bartered in their native tongues, translators struggling to keep pace. Mara stood at the viewport, her human eyes reflecting the swirling nebula beyond, when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A growl, low, primal, unmistakably threatening. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her hip where no weapon hung. The station had strict peace protocols, after all. What she saw made her breath catch, not from fear, but from recognition of something far more dangerous than a simple threat. Zek, barely 3 solar cycles old by Mara's estimation, crouched in the corner near the refreshment dispensers. The Kaitar cub's obsidian scales rippled with bioluminescent warnings, his triple-jointed limbs coiled tight as compressed springs. His species were apex predators on 17 colonized worlds, their adults standing 9 feet tall with claws that could slice through titanium plating. And this cub was terrified. Around Zek, a semicircle of curious onlookers had formed Venilari traders with their crystalline carapaces, a trio of methane-breathing Shoth in their environmental suits, even a Turellian diplomat whose tenure spanned centuries. They watched with that peculiar detachment of prey species observing a predator, academic interest masking their evolutionary dread. "Someone should contact station security," the Turellian murmured, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 diplomatic incidents. "Before it becomes violent." Mara's jaw tightened. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of a cornered animal, yes, but also in the eyes of a lost child. The distinction mattered, even if no one else seemed to notice. She stepped forward. The crowd collectively inhaled, their various respiratory systems creating a strange symphony of concern. The Turellian's hand shot out, not quite touching Mara's shoulder but broadcasting warning nonetheless. "Human, your species may be classified as persistence predators, but that creature's bite can sever limbs. Protocol dictates." "Protocol can wait," Mara said softly, never taking her eyes off Zek. She moved with deliberate slowness, each step announced by the soft click of her boots against the deck plating. Zek's growl intensified, his throat sac inflating with what would become a sonic scream if she triggered his final defense mechanism. His eyes, all 6 of them, tracked her approach with the calculating precision of a being bred for the hunt. Mara knew what the others couldn't possibly understand. She'd grown up on Earth, that strange death world where evolution had played cruel games with nearly every species. She'd raised dogs that descended from wolves. She'd watched barn cats tiny ambush predators nurse their young with the same ferocity they used to defend territory. She'd learned the universal language that separated predator from protector. When she was 5 feet away, Mara did something that made the entire observation deck fall silent. She sat down. Not crouched, not ready to spring or flee, but simply folded herself onto the cold metal floor, cross-legged at eye level with the terrified cub. Zek's growl faltered, confusion bleeding into his fear response. "Hey there," Mara said, her voice pitched low and steady, the same tone she'd used with every frightened creature she'd ever encountered. "You're lost, aren't you?" The cub's bioluminescence flickered purple, shifting to amber, the Kaitar equivalent of uncertainty. His claws, each the length of Mara's fingers, scraped against the deck as he shifted his weight. "I know how that feels," she continued, making no move to approach further. "Being somewhere you don't understand, everything too big, too loud, too strange. And everyone looking at you like you're the problem." Behind her, someone started to speak, probably to remind her of protocol again, but a sharp gesture from the Turellian silenced them. The old diplomat had lived long enough to recognize when interruption meant death. Zek's throat sac slowly deflated. One of his 6 eyes blinked independently of the others, a sign of cognitive processing in his species. Mara had done her homework during the long journey to this station. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival, and more importantly, it was compassion. "Your parent is probably looking for you right now," Mara said, probably scared out of their mind. Wondering where their cub wandered off to. At the word parent, Zek's scales rippled again. But this time, the color shifted to something Mara's translator identified as deep blue. Longing. Sadness. She'd guessed right. "You know what humans do when we're scared?" Mara asked, as if expecting an answer. "We look for something familiar, something safe. Sometimes that's a person. Sometimes it's just knowing we're not alone." Slowly, so slowly that it seemed to take an eternity, Mara extended her hand. Not reaching towards Zek, not demanding contact, just offering. Her palm up, fingers relaxed, the universal gesture that somehow transcended species and evolution. "I'm not your parent," she said quietly, "but I can sit here with you until they arrive. If you want." The observation deck held its collective breath. Somewhere in the distance, a docking klaxon sounded. A cargo hauler's engines thrummed through the superstructure. Life went on, indifferent to this small drama. Zek stared at Mara's hand for what felt like an age. Then, with movements that betrayed his predatory heritage, he crept forward. His obsidian scales caught the nebula's light, creating constellations across his small body. One clawed hand, designed to rend and tear, extended tentatively toward Mara's palm. Contact. The crowd gasped. A Kaitar cub's touch was said to be ice-cold, their biology running at temperatures that would make humans shiver. But Mara felt only warmth, the warmth of trust extended across the impossible gulf of species and instinct. Zek didn't climb into her lap, didn't suddenly become domesticated or tame. He simply sat there, one claw touching her hand, his bioluminescence gradually settling into soft green, the color of calm, of safety, of a fear that had finally found its answer. "There you are," a deep voice boomed across the observation deck. An adult Kaitar easily 9 feet tall, scales gleaming like polished obsidian armor, rushed forward with surprising grace. The crowd scattered, giving the apex predator a wide berth. But the adult's eyes, all 6 locked on the small figure beside the human, showed only relief. "Zek," the parent said, voice modulating to frequencies that Mara's translator could barely process. "You frightened me," Zek chirped, a sound Mara hadn't known the species could make, and scampered to his parent, who scooped the cub up with surprising gentleness. The adult Kaitar turned to Mara, who had risen to her feet but maintained her relaxed posture. Those 6 eyes studied her with an intelligence that reminded Mara why this species commanded respect across the galaxy. "You calmed my child," the Kaitar said slowly. "My species is taught that humans are strange soft where they should be hard, emotional where they should be logical, weak where they should be strong." A pause, weighted with significance. "We are taught many things that are not quite true, I think." Mara smiled, the expression translating poorly across species but carrying warmth nonetheless. "We have a saying on Earth, the strong protect the weak, but I think the real strength is knowing when to be gentle." The Kaitar's bioluminescence rippled through a spectrum of colors Mara had no names for. Then, in a gesture that made the entire observation deck freeze, the massive predator bowed, a formal acknowledgement of debt in Kaitar culture. "The galaxy teaches us to fear each other," the Kaitar said. "Perhaps there is another way." As the parent and cub departed, the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their commerce and their carefully maintained distances. But Mara noticed something had changed. The Turelian diplomat nodded to her with newfound respect. A Venlari trader's antennae twitched in what might have been a smile. Mara returned to the viewport, watching the nebula swirl with colors that reminded her of Zek's scales. Somewhere out there, humans were still considered a curiosity, a species that had clawed its way to the stars through stubbornness and adaptability rather than raw power or ancient wisdom. But maybe she thought humanity's real strength wasn't in how hard they could fight or how long they could endure. Maybe it was in moments like this, in the choice to sit with fear instead of running from it, to extend a hand instead of a fist, to recognize that sometimes the bravest thing a predator can do is choose gentleness. The stellar harmony continued its orbit, carrying its cargo of dreams and hopes across the void. And in one small corner of the observation deck, the warmth of an impossible connection lingered, a reminder that evolution might build walls between species, but compassion could always find a way through.